Hi, Zoom people. Yacht A, I'm Keely Toledo. I'm the co-president of Natives at Princeton, a student organization dedicated to advocating and supportive Native and Indigenous students at Princeton. So if you identify as Native or are Indigenous, definitely reach out to me and Natives at Princeton. We'd love to have you. And we are so honored to have Reverend Norwood here tonight. Dr. Reverend J.R. Norwood is an enrolled citizen of the Nanticoke Lenape Tribal Nation, which he served for many years as the principal justice of the Tribal Supreme Court and as a councilman. He is the co-chair of the Task Force on Federal Acknowledgement of the National Congress of American Indians and the general secretary of the Alliance of Colonial Arrow Tribes. He has represented his tribe at the national and international level and has been an advisor to government commissions and testified before the United States Congress. Dr. Norwood has published works and lectures on theology, history, culture, and Indigenous issues, and has been featured in numerous documentaries. He is a member of the Princeton University Art Museum Advocacy Group and for Indigenous North America. Coming to speak on New Jersey Indigenous history and sovereignty issues, please give your utmost respect as we are honored to have him here with us today. So we can give a quick round of applause for Dr. Reverend Norwood.
Well, I thank you, Keely, for that warm introduction and for the invitation. I want to thank Sydney Eck and Rick Curtis and Carolyn Perkins. It's a wonderful opportunity to be here and to speak to all of you. And for those of you who for the first time are in New Jersey, welcome to our homeland. I want to greet you in my native language. Itak wangomamuhemo, kalek papakomak deloense, hakke Nanticoke ok Lenape. I am a Nanticoke Lenape person that is indigenous to this territory. I'm going to share my screen at this time so we can talk a little bit about where you are and its history. I'm hoping everyone can see my screen. One of the things that a lot of people don't know is that the territory you are in, New Jersey, as it's called today, is the indigenous name for our state is Shakam, which means by the water's edge. 3 parts of our state are bordered by either a river, a bay, or an ocean. So there's water all around us. And the indigenous people of this land, while many have departed, and we'll talk a little about that, there are many of us that still remain. Some of the questions that I get on a regular basis about when people want to approach American Indians, they want to know exactly how should we refer to you? Are you a group? Are you a tribe? Are you a nation? What do we call you? And the fact of the matter is that the term group for an actual tribal nation is insulting. A group would be an organization, a collection of perhaps individuals that were cultural enthusiasts or perhaps a descendant organization. But community, tribe, and nation certainly do fit the bill because that's what we are. People wonder, should we be called American Indians? Should we be called Native Americans or Indigenous First Nations people? And that really depends on who you're talking to. I've heard different people with different preferences. Most will say, if you refer to me through my tribal identity, that is sufficient. So if you were to call me Nanticoke Lenape, then that would be sufficient. However, I don't have a problem with any of these terms. American Indian, Native American, Indigenous, First Nations person, all are acceptable to me, but it's good to ask how a person wishes to be referred to. Now, one of the things that we know is that the term Indian actually historically is an inaccurate term, and it's based in the fact that when Columbus came and the Europeans that immediately followed him came, many of them thought they were actually in India. And so we got that name. However, the reason that many of us continue to use it is because that is the word that is used in the treaties and in the legal documents in the United States. And we've had a history of winding up getting on the short end of many of the treaties and having the promises broken. So you will find many national Native organizations continue to use the term American Indian, such as the National Congress of American Indians or the National Museum of the American Indian. And that has become a traditional term also. One of the terms that is very insulting is prehistoric when you're talking about our people prior to the arrival of Europeans. It's as though history did not begin until Europeans settled this continent. And so we had no history prior to that contact. We prefer the term pre-contact because that's a far more accurate term. One of the things that I always tell people is that anyone who comes up to you and says something like American Indians believe or American Indians feel that, or this is what American Indians do, probably doesn't know what they're talking about. There are many, many different cultures just in the continental United States, let alone all of North and South America. And while there are many common values and even some similar practices, there's also many differences, many varying practices, many varying perspectives. I have been in the room with 10 or 12 tribal leaders, and if you ask their opinion on a particular issue, you may wind up with 14 or 15 different perspectives out of the 10 or 12 tribal leaders. So we don't all think alike. We don't all see things alike. While there are many things that we have in common, many values that we have in common, the cultures are very different. They vary by region, they vary by tribe, and sometimes they even vary by clan within a given tribe. It's important that we try to correct the errors that people have about American Indian culture, and a lot of it comes out of the way we have been portrayed in the media and in entertainment for many generations. The one thing that I often hear is people asking, did my people live in teepees? Well, most of the northeastern tribes, I believe all of the northeastern tribes would be able to say that, did not live in teepees. That was a phenomenon that was more akin to the Plains Indians in the Midwest, but we here in this region of North America lived in wigwams and in longhouses. We had organized villages. Some of our villages, especially in the northern part of the state, have palisades or kind of like fort walls around them. In the southern part of the state, that wasn't the case, but the villages were always organized around a central meeting house. We were not devil worshippers. We were not pagans. We're not civilized or uncivilized. Matter of fact, both Nanticoke and Lenape people were always monotheistic and always had our own culture, had our own civilization, although it was different from what you might find in Europe. The people here were not nomadic. We did not follow the buffalo, so to speak. That's something that happened elsewhere in the country. Matter of fact, we were pretty sedentary. We typically had two locations that we would have villages. One would be in the interior part of the state during the winter, and during the warmer southern months, we would be by the water's edge, either by the rivers or by the ocean. We never all looked alike in North America. We all look different. And the photograph that you see at the bottom of this page is actually a photograph of the people that are involved with the New Jersey Commission on American Indian Affairs. And just like they all look different, American Indians from one side of the continent to the other also looked very different and still do today. We're not reenactors. So there are those that think that when we are wearing our traditional garments, when we are doing ceremony, that we're reenacting something. No, we're actually expressing and living out our culture, and we don't call what we wear a costume. A costume is something that you wear when you're portraying someone that you're not or something that you're not. We wear regalia, which is a portrayal of who we actually are and who our ancestors were. According to the 2010 census, something that a lot of people don't realize is that 78% of people who identify as American Indian don't live on reservations. We live among everyone else. For the most part. There are many tribal people that do live on tribal reservations here in the United States, but the vast majority do not. The other thing is we're not stuck in the past. Our culture is ever evolving. We honor the traditions of the past. We try to bring them forward, but we are not stuck in the past. Oftentimes we're viewed kind of like the dinosaurs, and people are surprised when when they see us or when we are portraying some aspect of our culture for the public. That I often get the surprised expression, oh, I didn't even know you people were still here. Some of the other stereotypes that we need to try to overcome is that we don't all receive government checks. Matter of fact, most American Indians, if they receive any support from their tribal government, it is because of the tribal government either making money or having arranged receiving funds from the federal government similar to that of a state, because tribes serve their people, just like states do. Most American Indians don't live on reservations, as I said before. We have houses and jobs. We're citizens of the United States, citizens of our tribe, citizens of the state that we're in. Not all want or have casinos. In fact, my tribe has it by law that we cannot profit from any form of vice. In the area of New Jersey and down into Delaware, we have what is traditionally the land of the Lenape and the Nanticoke. Now, the Lenape, or the original people, are referred to as the grandfathers or ancient ones by many of the tribes that are in the northeastern portion of the country. And it is because many of the Algonquian-speaking tribes view the Lenape people as their ancient root, the ancestor tribe from which many sprang. One of those tribes is the Nanticoke. And while the Lenape, the Lenape homeland called Lenape included all of New Jersey, a portion of southeastern New York, southwestern Connecticut, a portion of Pennsylvania along the Delaware River, and the northern portion of the state of Delaware was called Lenape-Hoking. The area just south was the Nanticoke territory, and the Nanticoke and the Lenape people have always been extremely close, intermarried, and the Nanticoke in ancient times actually came from the Lenape, like many other tribes. And shortly after contact, many Nanticoke people migrated back into and intermarried with their Lenape distant relatives. My people, the Nanticoke Lenape, actually live on the border between the old Lenape territory in the southern portion and the Nanticoke, the northern portion of the Nanticoke territory. Early captures resulted in initial hostile reception for many of the Europeans that first tried to move into our territory, and it was because some of our people were actually taken during some of the early exploration by Europeans. And so we became extremely defensive. However, we had after an initial hostile interaction with John Smith, the captain who was famous for dealing with the Jamestown colony, he also dealt with our people. He learned that if he were to leave an offering on the shoreline, that we might be more willing to talk, and that's what he did. And we wound up trading with the Jamestown colony early in the history of colonial settlement. And that's the Nanticoke people, our Nanticoke ancestors that were down on the Delmarva Peninsula. In the ensuing years, 90% of our population was decimated because of disease and war. One of our ancient chiefs is recorded as saying, for every European that got off one of the boats, 9 of us died. The new immigrants who initially needed our help to survive wound up presuming authority over our lands and even over our people under the Doctrine of Discovery and the concept of manifest destiny. And we'll be talking a little more about that a little later on. In New Jersey, one of the reasons that my people were able to stay in southern New Jersey is because of the interaction with the Quakers. We had a peaceful interaction with the Quakers and also a peaceful interaction with the Swedish colony called New Sweden that was before them. And the Quakers came and actually lived among us and traded with us and attempted to live in peace with us in southern New Jersey. Fenwick's colony was established through treaties with the Lenape chiefs way back in the 1670s. There was another treaty that's relatively famous, and the artistic depictions of it you can be found all over the world, and that is the Treaty of Shakam, often called the Penn Treaty of Peace or the Treaty of Amity, which took place in 1682 in Philadelphia. And William Penn, the governor of Pennsylvania at that time under British rule, and our chief Tamminen, who was the spokesperson for our Council of Chiefs at this great meeting, exchanged wampum belts. And that the picture you see is actually a photograph of that wampum belt. Our people continue to live in peace with the Quakers up to this day, even though William Penn's son stole a lot of land from us in what was called the walking purchase. That was a fraud perpetuated upon our people after his father had gone back to England and had subsequently died. Some of you may be familiar with the Doctrine of Discovery, but what I have found is that most have never studied it. Most have never had it presented to them, and it's not a typical part of school curricula here in the United States, even though it should be. And the Doctrine of Discovery is traced back to various policies from papal bulls or edicts that wound up governing the interactions between the Christian nations of Europe and those nations that were deemed to be pagan or heathen nations, those that were not ruled by a Christian monarch. And it was the doctrine that allowed any Roman Catholic monarch to take control of the lands of anyone they determined was an infidel or was not under the authority of the church. This started in dealing with those that were opposing Christian rule in the Holy Land, but it continued throughout the entire world in regard to when European explorers representing Christian kings would land and claim land on behalf of that kingdom. The language that was used by Pope Nicholas V is that they were allowed to capture, vanquish, and subdue the Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to put them into perpetual slavery, to take all their possessions and their property. And this wound up being the principle upon which much federal law still is based. As the colonies continued to develop in our homeland, there were laws that were passed that actually persecuted our people. We were relegated to reservations. A lot of people don't know that the oldest reservations were here in the East among the people of first contact. There were several on the Delmarva Peninsula. There was an official reservation also here in New Jersey. There were quite a few up in New England. And there were also many Indian towns where our people were allowed to live in relative peace, but were essentially restricted to try to stay in these small areas. In 1673, the Nanticoke people they actually had a price put on their head by the Maryland General Assembly. And a hostile Indian, the scalp of a hostile Indian was worth 50 pounds. And it didn't matter whether that was a man or woman or a child. And an enemy Indian was defined by anyone who did not immediately call aloud within 100 paces of an Englishman's cleared ground. If they came across one of my ancestors in the woods, who may have been on a hunt or in the midst of a ceremony, who did not voluntarily call out and lay down their weapons in a sign of surrender, then they were deemed to be hostile and could be killed and their scalp taken to a government official, and they could be paid a sum of money for that scalp. That, by the way, is the origin of the term redskin. While there are some who refer to the brownish red skin of our people, or the fact that sometimes we would paint ourselves and make our skins red, the term actually became associated with these bloody scalps over time, and people would ask, how many red skins do you have? And they would be paid in that amount. That's one of the reasons that the term is considered quite an insult to this day. By the end of the 17th century, the Nanticoke and Lenape people had been pressured either to move on to reservations or forced to migrate. And the migration that occurred pushed the majority of our people further and further west, winding up in Oklahoma and up into Wisconsin and up into Ontario, Canada, where many of the tribal people still are in communities today. We that remained were forced to adapt to Anglo-American lifeways, and we continued to live in small tribal communities that remained. But those of us that did remain in the homeland were often reclassified by the government as either free persons of color or mulatto instead of Indian. And the reason that that occurred was because of the policy of the governments that were here. In 1740, there was a law in Delaware that indicated and defined an Indian as a non-Christian living in the woods and eating primarily deer meat. By that time, by 1740, many of my ancestors were living in European-style houses and were eating chicken and pork, and therefore no longer were considered to be Indian, especially if they had converted to Christianity. If you were baptized as a Christian, you were racially reclassified in the records. I have ancestors that are identified as Indian or in early records, and then are identified as either free persons of color or mulatto later on in the record. And the only difference is that this same person happened to be baptized as a Christian. By 1770, the Delaware legislature had a definition of an Indian as those that were living far away from the state of Delaware, essentially using it as a form of administrative genocide to reclassify those that had remained in the state as no longer being American Indian. The policy of the United States for many years was to kill the Indian and save the man. In other words, to actually take their culture from them. And the way that this was done was to actually take our children and to place them in boarding schools that were either run by the federal government or they were run by affiliated religious organizations. And it was to assimilate and destroy the tribal culture of the children. The photographs that you see are from those Indian schools. The one on the left is from the Carlisle Indian Institute in Pennsylvania. It is now the War College out there. And there are grave markers of where many of the Native children were taken and subsequently died at the schools, sadly, in many, many instances. And what is sad is that many people right there in Carlisle don't even know the history of that institution and why there are these children's graves there. The little handcuffs that you see are from the Haskell Indian Institute, which is now Haskell Indian University. And in its history, children were subdued with these little handcuffs that could only be placed all around the wrists of a small child. I myself have relatives that went to Haskell in past generations. There are historically verifiable communities that still are in the region today in New Jersey and Delaware. Starting from the northernmost part of our state, we have the Ramapo Lenape Nation. They are of a Muncie derivation. The Muncie were the northernmost division of the Lenape people. Slightly below them are the Sand Hill Indians. They are not state recognized, but they are acknowledged as Lenape people. They're a mix of Lenape and Cherokee, and they've been here in the state for many generations. The Powhatan Lenape Nation in Burlington County is a community of Lenape people that many of the Indians from Virginia migrated up and intermarried with them. And they came and they're still living in the area of Burlington County known as Delaire and Pennsauken. The Nanticoke Lenape Tribal Nation is the southernmost of the New Jersey tribes, and actually is the largest, has the largest population in New Jersey, and that's my tribe. And then the two tribes in Delaware, the Lenape Indian Tribe of Delaware and the Nanticoke Indian Tribe of Delaware, are all interrelated with the Nanticoke Lenape people. It's the same families, the same surnames, and our people have been intermarrying for 200 years or more at least. The Nanticoke Lenape people are the original people of the region of the Delaware Bay, and we are the families that are descended from both Lenape and Nanticoke. We were the border Indians, and in history, we were referred to as the Bay Indians by the British. And also, just so you're aware, you may have heard of the name Delaware Indian. Those that migrated away, were forced to migrate away, continued to use that term. That was how the British referred to the Lenape people. Those of us who stayed in the home territory tended not to utilize that name, but continued to use Nanticoke or Lenape. Our people continued in tribal churches. For many generations, the one way that we could continue our tribal community and to have leadership and government among our people was to do so within the Christian churches that were established by our people. In the early 1800s, our people began to have their own congregations as opposed to being ministered to by non-native congregations and attending them. And those churches are considered to be historic in each of the states, Delaware and New Jersey, and they're still around. And for the better part of 150 to 175 years, the government of our tribes were in these churches, and the people continued to interact between those communities, one with another. Those churches established institutions. They had schools that were meeting in them and eventually had their own facilities and buildings. And out from the churches were developed an elected tribal council and chieftaincy after not really being able to have that for so many generations. Instead of the leadership of the tribe being the leadership in the church, the tribes continued to honor and have relationships with their congregations, but began to move out of the churches and reestablish formal elected tribal governments. That began in the late 1800s, continued through to the 1960s and 70s. And these are Nanticoke Lenape people that you see here. The one exception in the photograph would be the lady that is in the black and white photograph in the upper left-hand corner. She is a Mohican Indian and a rather famous anthropologist, came and studied our families in Delaware. Her name is Gladys Tantaquidgeon. The gentleman on the right is Chief Mark Gould. He is the current chief of our tribe. We have a continuing relationship of over 3 centuries with the nation of Sweden because, as I mentioned earlier, the colony of New Sweden was here in our territory in the 1600s, prior to the arrival of the British. And while our people had an on-again, off-again relationship with the Dutch colonial powers, sometimes trading with them and sometimes fighting them, we had a relatively peaceful relationship with the Swedes. What we see here in the photograph is the royal family of Sweden being greeted by our chiefs. We have entertained the royal family on several occasions, and our people actually opened the Swedish embassy in DC about 10 or 12 years ago. And the relationship continues to this day, similar to the relationship that we have with the Quakers. It's important to understand exactly what an American Indian tribe is. And those of you who are part of the Native Americans of Princeton would be very familiar with this, but there may be some who are not. And it's important to know this because there are some organizations that coalesce of individuals who may have taken a genetic test and suddenly discovered that they have some Indian ancestry, that may pool together and want to celebrate that ancestry. And that's a wonderful thing, and we encourage that. The problem is when a new organization that has no history behind it suddenly starts using the terminologies of tribal government. That creates confusion. And an authentic Indian tribe is a community that has a history that's continuous. It's going back at least a couple of 100 years. To use the nomenclature of band, tribe, nation, or something along those lines, you really should have some interrelationship of historic tribal families that have been together in community and have governed themselves at least since the 1800s and as far back as it can be traced. So tribes are historic and continuous, interrelated, and self-governing. There is a uniqueness of indigenousness here in the United States, because unlike other racial groups that have come here, non-Indigenous groups, their cultural heritage exists somewhere else in some foreign land. And it will continue regardless of any suppression or modification in this country. Whereas for the indigenous people of these lands, the cultures only exist here, and any suppression would lead to total annihilation of that culture, cultural extinction worldwide if it is suppressed here. And it's amazing that the indigenous cultures have survived and that indigenous tribes have continued since there actually was an agenda for about a century or so within the United States to detribalize our people and to assimilate us and to make us essentially kind of like European. Self-identification is accepted for non-indigenous groups. If you say you're British, or if you say you're French, or if you say you're from Japan, that's accepted. Whatever you say is just simply accepted. For indigenous people, tribal people here, we have to be able to prove who we are. We need to be acknowledged by a tribe that is also acknowledged by non-native authorities, or you become suspect. The situation with Elizabeth Warren a few years ago, where she told the story of her native ancestry and was ridiculed for it because she was not a member of a tribe, and even though she never claimed to be. And you saw the level of hostility that was against her, and that's because it is difficult to make that claim and in any way that isn't going to be examined by someone else. Other than the victims of American slavery, people that are here in the United States have a choice to be part of the melting pot, whereas indigenous people were subject to cultural destruction as a part of federal policy. Tribal sovereignty is extremely important, and it's an inherent right for our people to govern ourselves. It's uniquely important because here within the United States, we are actually a nation that has nations within it, even though most Americans don't seem to understand or recognize that. And also we find that there are many Americans who become hostile to the indigenous tribes when they assert their own indigenous national right. According to the standard of federal Indian law, our sovereignty, our right to govern ourselves, to have our own laws, isn't something that is derived from the federal government saying you can do it. In fact, if another entity says that they're giving you sovereignty, you are never really sovereign to begin with. You really don't have sovereignty at all. Sovereignty is inherent. It's part of your history. From a native perspective, it's given by the creator. From the governmental perspective, it is something that is simply part of the history because our people, our governments, our tribal governments existed before the creation of the United States. But there is a constant assault on American Indian identity and sovereignty here in this country. And if you look at the maps, you can see from the dark shaded areas straight down to the one that looks spotted, the loss of our lands, the loss of the control over our lands, the way we've had to fight to maintain our identity. Some of those assaults were from the Doctrine of Discovery, the principle of manifest destiny, which is clearly displayed in the shrinking of the dark area on the map, current federal Indian law and policy, and also the redefining of what it means to be an Indian, American Indian nation or tribe or individual, that the definitions actually change from one federal law to another. Something that a lot of people don't realize, especially in celebrating the 4th of July and Independence Day, as the Declaration of Independence is read aloud, is that in the earliest documents that we have in the establishment of our government, there is a huge insult against the indigenous people of this land, even though those of us of first contact in many instances were the reason that the early European settlements were able to survive because of our charity, because of our care, because of showing people how to survive in the land, and in some instances actually taking care of the early settlers from Europe. We're referred to as merciless Indian savages. in the Declaration of Independence. The doctrine of discovery that I had mentioned earlier actually becomes part of American Indian law and policy. There are three pivotal decisions called the Marshall Trilogy that began to redefine our rights and to narrow the scope of our sovereignty from the perspective of federal law. And in the final decision, it actually has the audacity to say in Worcester versus Georgia that we willingly subjected ourselves to European powers and surrendered full sovereignty, which is an absolute lie, but it has been incorporated into federal Indian policy and law. So much so that it wasn't until 1879 that American Indians were considered persons under the meaning of the law. It wasn't until 1924 that American Indian people that were living on reservations were considered citizens of the United States. It wasn't until 1978 that we had the right to practice religious beliefs and spiritual practices, although not all tribal people have that right even today. And this isn't just something from the distant past. As recently as 2005, the much celebrated Associate Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually cited the Doctrine of Discovery in one of the decisions that she wrote for, and diminished the rights of the Oneida Indian Nation, citing the Doctrine of Discovery. It's important that natives, the traditional people of this land, defend our inherent sovereignty. It's essential as we continue to perpetuate who we are here in our ancestral territory. And the attributes of American Indian tribal sovereignty not only include the ability of tribal governments to govern ourselves, to govern our people, but also to have control over our lands, the territories in which we live, to have some control over our traditional territories, even if we don't actually occupy and live on that entire territory anymore. One of the names that's given to those of us that stayed here in the traditional homeland is the keepers of the land. Our relatives that were forced to migrate and wound up going as far north as Canada referred to us as the keepers of the land, the ones that stayed behind. This is a photograph of Chief Gould, my chief, and he is on the ancestral land. And the land is extremely important to us, and our tie to the land is extremely important to us. Our relationship with the land begins with the fact that we believe that the Creator gave us the land for our people to use and to care for. That we have a relationship is very different from the way that land tenure is understood from a European context that wound up being adopted as the standard here in the United States. When the Europeans first came to settle here in our territory, our understanding of the land was that it was here for us to use. It had been given to our people to be the stewards over, and we were to share it with whoever would acknowledge that relationship along with us and would live in relationship with us. And those relationships were to be continued through a process of gift giving and be renewed on a regular basis. Well, that was very different from the way that the colonists viewed land tenure. They figured that if we gave you some trinkets or traded with something and you put an X or your symbol on a document, it wasn't your land anymore. Now it was ours. And so that was a very different view of land being something that was alive, that you had a connection to, versus land being a commodity that was simply bought and sold for its resources. Our people, in our relationship with the land, view that the land itself traditionally is living. And this is a spiritual, a moral value that has been passed down from one generation to the next. And so much so that many of the tribal people of North America refer to our continent as Turtle Island. And it goes back to an ancient story. And I've been surprised how many different tribal nations share in some version of this story across North America. But for the Nanticoke and Lenape people, it's the belief that in ancient times, the land actually grew on the back of a turtle. And the bit of the bottom of the ocean that was brought up and placed on the land and was spread out by the creator actually was from the paw of one of the most humble of the creatures on our land, the muskrat, which is what you see there. And so there is a sense of interconnectedness with the land, with the creatures of the land, the fact that we need to respect the land and treat it as it has a life force of its own, that it is living in some way. And that's something that we carry forward in our traditional ways. There has been, in recent years, an awakening among even non-natives as to the importance of this relationship. The water protectors that joined at Standing Rock came from all different cultures, all different types of people, all different backgrounds, joined together to try to protect the environment, to protect the rights of the native people. One of the themes was water is life. And it was a wonderful thing to see that support. For us, it wasn't just a matter of the water. It's a continuing relationship with that place, with the creatures that are there, with the people that lived there before us, with the bones of our ancestors. And one of the quotes that's particularly poignant is by Mary Brafebird. The land is sacred. These words are at the core of your being. The land is our mother, the rivers our blood. Take our land away and we die. That is the Indian in us dies. I have a personal experience that I'll share very briefly, and it's something that I experienced on a tour in a ferry that went around the island of Manhattan. I was with a study group in a fellowship. We were looking at the problems of New Jersey and looking at different ways to solve them. And among my colleagues, all of them were at one end of this boat going around Manhattan, and they were oohing and eyeing as they looked at the buildings. And the buildings were impressive, and the skyline of Manhattan is famous, and this photograph is even quite beautiful with its colors. And I had the exact opposite reaction. Something deep within me did not see it the way they saw it. And I actually was on the other side of the boat looking at it, and I could barely control my emotions. Tears flowed from my eyes because I couldn't see the land. All I could see were buildings and concrete. I couldn't see a tree. And my reaction was as one mourning a death at the back of that boat. And it was because of that ancient connection. The island of Manhattan is a part of the Lenape Hoking. And to look there and not see the beauty of nature at all was very disturbing, very disturbing. That's part of my personal experience. And not only was I looking at this land that no longer seemed to have nature, but where were the creatures that lived, those that made their homes in what had been there but was no more there? It was just a total emotional reaction that I had to deal with. For traditional indigenous people, life is sacred and it belongs to the creator just like the land, and we're connected to the animals that are around us. Traditional hunters actually would prey over animals that they would take for sustenance, and we were never to overhunt. In fact, it was a misinterpretation of our practices of hunting that many Europeans thought that we preyed to animals and trees, when actually what it is when you took an animal for food, you would offer tobacco, and you would actually thank the creator for the animal's life and apologize to the animal for having to do it, and thank the animal for the sacrifice that would sustain you and your people. The same when we would harvest things from nature, plants and bits of the bark of trees. We would do what we could to never do anything to over harvest so that there was always a way for that thing to grow back. And there was the same ceremony that was done with an understanding that you lived in relationship with all that there was. One of the things that was mentioned to me was that the sponsor for tonight is dealing with the issue of landfulness and taking a look at how you will be experiencing and trying to grow in your understanding of this term. And to be quite honest, it was a new term for me, but the principle behind it is a very old principle and part of the traditional culture from which I come. Molly Baker says that landfulness, it is through purposeful consideration of our relationship to the land that we develop our own ever-evolving personal processes of coming to know a place. Rather than traveling through the land, we begin to travel with and in the land. This is a very traditional way of looking at it, that, you know, one of the things that we see is often people will visit a place and they won't really experience where they are. It is as though they don't take the time to think deeply about it, to think about the history of what was there, the story of that place, from ancient stories straight through to the modern day, and how you will interact with it. That's how traditionally my people always see the land. And the more that people begin to experience the land that way, the less we will abuse it, and the fewer environmental problems that we will have. And I think the healthier we will be overall. So you are now in Shakam, and one of the things that I encourage you to do is to experience the land. For those of you who are here in New Jersey, perhaps for the first time, you may have an idea of what New Jersey was based on television shows that seem to always poke fun at us or poor representations of our state. But our land is actually beautiful and very, very diverse, from the mountains up in the northwestern part of the state down through the Delaware River to the Jersey Shore, the White Sands, to Cape May and the Pine Barrens in their natural beauty, and the Delaware Bay. Matter of fact, in New Jersey, you can see the sun rise and set over water without ever leaving the state. The traditional names of the land are something that you should try to get to know. In truth, some of the town names and place names are so old and archaic, and oftentimes a European mispronunciation of a Lenape word, but it's good to try to learn them anyway, and to try to learn the history and to try to learn what those things meant, because it'll tell the story of the land. The Delaware River, for example, is the Lenape, and that is because it is the mighty rushing water of the Lenape. It is a claim of whose river that is, running through the heart of Lenape. The Delaware Bay, which is where my people come from, was Pawtucket, the round water, which is where the waters of the Delaware flow into the Atlantic. Come to know this place and to be in relationship with it and experience it and to know its stories. It's better that you enjoy it now before someone comes and pollutes it, wastes it, limits access to it, sells it for $2 a bottle, and then calls it progress. I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions. I share with you these links if you're interested in learning more about the indigenous people of the state in which you now dwell. I thank you. I'm not sure what's supposed to happen now.
Okay. Am I now unmuted on Zoom? Yes, wonderful. So thank you so much, Reverend Norwood, for joining us tonight and for really sharing some of the important history of New Jersey. All of us now are New Jersey residents. And for the next 4 years, all of you are part of the rich history that Reverend Norwood has shared with us. So I would certainly be happy to take any questions from here. And Caroline, I know you're in the other room with Keely. And so I think you would need to unmute yourself over there, Caroline, in the Makash 10 thing. But are there any questions here that people would like to ask Reverend Norwood? Oh, I see way back up there. So Reverend Norwood, the question is if you could tell us a little bit about the structure of the tribe.
Yes, our tribe is organized under a tribal constitution that actually has 3 branches of government, both executive and legislative and judicial. The chief is elected by the people along with the tribal council. The chief and tribal council form kind of a combination of the executive and the legislative. We have a tribal court, a Supreme Court. I have served on that court and also served as a councilman for quite a few years. The tribal court also has what's called peacekeeping judges that settle disputes among our people. There is the tribe has several entities under the tribal government, organizations, corporations, 2 charities and some companies that are government contracting companies. We have land down in southern New Jersey in the home territory where actually near where the treaties were cut with Fenwick's colony over 300 years ago.
Question back here. So the question is, what can students who have Native American ancestry do to get involved with Native American groups on campus? I pass that back to Sydney. Caroline, I'd like to hop over to you if there are questions from the other room as well.
Yeah, a question that I have is like, how can members of the Princeton community like reach and outreach to the Lenape people, or how can we support your efforts and things, especially with like COVID precautions still taking place? What's the best way that we can support?
One of the things is the state has a Commission on American Indian Affairs that has announcements of various events that are going on, issues that have come up. And they do have a website that I believe I had that on my list. If I didn't, I can make sure you get it. But if you just do a search for the New Jersey Commission on American Indian Affairs, there's a lot of information there. There are links to each of the state recognized tribes. COVID has impacted our people, obviously, like it's impacted everybody around the world. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to have public events. Our tribe has an annual public powwow. We have outreaches and educational outreaches and programming that we do. We have a tribal store. We were finishing a new tribal museum just prior to the pandemic. Hopefully these things will be put back in place as we were able to get this under control. In the meantime, though, you can visit the websites to find out what's going on, to find out our issues. And there are many events that are held around the state where the public is invited. I know that the New Jersey Historic Commission is conducting a series of online seminars with the hope of having an in-person seminar in November. And if you go on to the New Jersey Commission on American Indian Affairs or the New Jersey Historic Commission website, you can find information where there are some of the indigenous people of the state that are making presentations and talking about history and culture and all kinds of things. Interaction with us at this point is a little limited because of COVID, but traveling to the tribal areas for tribal events that are open to the public and getting to know the people is the best way to start.
Thank you.
Caroline, other questions from your room?
Yeah, we have
I don't know if it's my sound that went out, but
No, I think Carol, it looks like
He's
Caroline
coming to the stage.
with a mic. Caroline, do you have one for us?
We are getting the question and then we will repeat over Zoom. Can you hear that, Rick?
Yes, Caroline.
Okay.
So the question was that you mentioned earlier, Reverend, that Christian churches and communities have intertwined with the Lenape. So how does Christian ideologies interact or kind of change traditional teachings of in your community?
actually that's what my doctoral dissertation was on, the history of that interaction and the challenges for Christian mission in and among my people. The first thing is that because the Nanticoke and Lenape people were always monotheistic, the concept of a creator that sent his son to die on behalf of the people was not difficult for us to understand. Early on with the Quakers and then with the Reformed and Presbyterians and Episcopalians, our people began worshiping in their churches, worshiping among them. When the Methodist movement got started back in the 1780s and the early 1800s, that influenced our people. Matter of fact, each of the tribal churches, and I'm not one of the pastors of the tribal church, I pastor a church in the city of Trenton, but that many of the people are, all of those churches were Methodist, are Methodist to this very day. And in regard to the interaction with tribal culture, there are those today who are predominantly follow the old ways and don't consider themselves Christian. There are those who are Christian and don't follow the old ways. And then there are those who do both. And those who do both would maintain a Christian expression through utilizing their own cultural traditions. So, for example, when we have prayer at the tribal center, and if it's one of the Christian prayer services, and also during our powwow, we actually have a Christian church service. We open with drums and we open with communal singing oftentimes in our native tongue. We smudge, which is kind of like the equivalent of Roman Catholics or Episcopalians using incense to bless the area. The interpretation of some of the practices has changed because of the adoption of the Christian faith, but the use of the practices under those new interpretations oftentimes will continue. One of the things, especially in our burial practices, which unfortunately in recent months has been all too often, there are traditional things that will happen after the Christian burial service and committal. One of the traditional spiritual leaders will lead in a particular ceremony as blessing the body. So there are different things that do continue that work in tandem with the Christian faith.
Reverend Norwood, we really want to thank you for so graciously spending this time with us. I think this has been a wonderful opportunity for people to really think. And over the next 3 days, they will be exploring the traditional lands of the Lenape people. And I think this is a wonderful way for all of them to think more deeply about where they are traveling and what it's meant for so many generations. So thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. We thank you. We say Wanishi. Wanishi, thank you.